Good morning. We'll get started in a few minutes here. Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started with some housekeeping remarks that we do before all these meetings. First off, welcome those who are here. Good morning. My name is Ian McMillan. I am an Assistant Deputy Executive Officer in the Planning Division here at South Coast AQMD. We're here to talk about the Coachella Valley uh, uh, contingency measure and feasibility justification as part of the state implementation plan. As far as the housekeeping, we'll go through that first, and then we'll get through a couple presentations, and then we'll open it up for public comment after that. So first, we'd like to facilitate a smooth meeting with public participation. We have two formats for participation, the Zoom web application as well as teleconference. Before we begin, I'd like to review some guidelines and general instructions. First, please silence your other communication devices, such as your cell or desk phone. This will ensure that we're not hearing any feedback or causing interruption during the meeting. This meeting is being translated into Spanish. To watch or listen to this meeting in the language of your choice, click on the globe icon labeled Interpretation at the bottom of your screen. From there, select the language of your choice. After you select your language, if you hear both languages at the same time, please click Mute Original Audio. For those participating by phone, if you wish to hear the meeting in Spanish, please use the phone number and meeting ID number posted on the agenda. I'm going to pause now for the interpreters to repeat some of this in Spanish.
Muy buenos días. Bienvenidos a la reunión del día de hoy del Distrito de Gestión de Calidad del Aire de la Costa Sur. Esta reunión se está llevando a cabo tanto en línea, en Zoom, y tienen acceso también a esta vía teléfono, teleconferencia. Para hacerlo en Zoom, por favor, vayan a la parte inferior de la pantalla, hagan clic en el icono de interpretación en el globo terráqueo que aparece allí y seleccione la lengua en la que desea participar, español en este caso. Haga clic en el botón que dice silenciar audio original si escucha ambos idiomas a la misma vez. Si desea conectarse por teleconferencia, el número es el 1-669-900-6033. Repito, 1-669-900-6033. El número de identificación de la llamada es el 932-0955-9643. Repito, 932-0955-9643. Back to you, Ian.
Great, thank you so much. So for all participants on Zoom, except for panelists, they will be placed on mute by the host. You will not be able to mute or unmute your line manually. For those on Zoom, if you would like to make public comment on the Zoom screen, please click on the raise hand button. For those calling in by phone, you can dial *9 to signal that you would like to comment. Your name or part of your phone number will be called when it is your turn to comment, and the host will unmute your line automatically. Please note you can hang up or leave the Zoom meeting at any time. Please treat others with courtesy, civility, and respect. Failure to do so can result in your mic being muted or you being dropped from the meeting. Lastly, please be aware that this video conference meeting is being recorded. By participating in this meeting hosted by South Coast AQMD, you agree to authorize recording of audio and visual content presented during the live event and consent to subsequent use of the recording in the public domain by South Coast AQMD. Okay, that's all the housekeeping. So again, welcome everybody. I want to do just a quick bit of introductions for those that are on camera. So I'm going to go in the order that I see on my screen. So Singmi, can you introduce yourself?
So, good morning, everyone. My name is Singmi Lee. I'm Planning and Rules Manager working in SIP Inventory, SIP Development. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Eric.
Hi, good morning. Eric Prasky. I supervise the team responsible for developing state implementation plan revisions.
Great, thanks. John?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jong-Hoon Lee. I'm Air Quality Specialist in Planning Division at South Coast AQMD.
Great. Barbara?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Barbara Baird. I'm Chief Deputy Counsel in the Legal Division at South Coast AQMD.
Great, thanks. All right, well, we have two presentations lined up today, one from South Coast AQMD and then another from CARB, and CARB staff will introduce themselves just before their presentation, and then we'll move on to public comment period. So let's go to the first presentation, and Eric, I think you're up.
Okay, thanks, Ian. So I'll be presenting South Coast AQMD's proposed contingency measure and infeasibility justification for the 2008 ozone standard in the Coachella Valley. Next slide, please. I'll begin by providing an overview of ozone air quality in the Coachella Valley. Next, I'll discuss the proposed contingency measure and infeasibility justification, and then I'll wrap up with conclusion and next steps. Next slide. Next. I want to begin by providing some background about our agency, the South Coast Air Quality Management District. We are the local air pollution control agency responsible for the South Coast Air Basin and Coachella Valley. Our jurisdiction encompasses all of Orange County, as well as portions of LA, San Bernardino, and Riverside counties. We are the largest of the 35 local air agencies in California, and as well as across the rest of the nation. And our jurisdiction encompasses over 10,000 square miles and over 17 million residents. In terms of responsibilities, we regulate emissions primarily from stationary sources. We develop and implement plans to meet national air quality standards. We permit and inspect over 28,000 businesses, and we administer over $100 million of incentive funding annually. Next slide. This presentation is regarding the Coachella Valley, which is defined as the desert portion of Riverside County in the Salton Sea Air Basin. As you can see in the map at the right, this area encompasses Palm Springs, Indio, Mecca, and a portion of the Salton Sea. Coachella Valley is located downwind of the South Coast Air Basin, and I'll discuss why that's relevant in a couple slides. The Coachella Valley fails to meet multiple federal ozone standards. As a result, South Coast AQMD is required to develop air quality plans and meet certain requirements for non-attainment areas under the Federal Clean Air Act. Next slide. So ozone formation in the atmosphere begins with emissions of volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, and nitrogen oxides, or NOx. VOCs and NOx are emitted by a variety of sources, including mobile sources such as cars, trucks, ships, and aircraft, stationary sources such as refineries and power plants, biogenics such as trees and soil, and wildfires. In the presence of sunlight, VOCs and NOx react to form ozone, and short-term exposure to high ozone levels can cause health problems, including damage to lungs and airways, changes in heart function, increased inflammation, and in some cases, premature death. And that's really why EPA sets health-based air quality standards for ozone. Next slide. Okay, so I mentioned that the Coachella Valley is downwind of the South Coast Air Basin. The South Coast Air Basin has a much higher population density, as well as a much larger array of emission sources compared to the Coachella Valley. And due to the sea breeze, those emissions and as well as ozone that's formed in the basin end up getting transported in a generally west to east direction, and those emissions and ozone go through the Banning Pass and into the Coachella Valley. And so the ozone attainment challenges that the Coachella Valley experiences are in large part the result of emissions that occur upwind in the South Coast Air Basin. Next slide. So here we're seeing ozone air quality trends over the past few decades in the Coachella Valley. I want to draw your attention to the upper gray dashed line. That's the 1 hour ozone standard at 120 ppb. For the purposes of comparison to this standard, we look at the red line, and you can see that for well over a decade, that red line has been well below that threshold. And so the Coachella Valley actually meets the 1 hour ozone standard. However, there are also a few 8 hour ozone standards that range from 70 to 80 ppb. And for the purpose of comparison with these standards, we look at the blue line. So you can see that clearly a lot of progress has been made to reduce these 8 hour ozone levels. However, we do still have a ways to go, especially to meet the 75 and 70 ppb 8 hour ozone standards. Next slide. So the Coachella Valley attains the 1 hour standard. However, the Coachella Valley is classified as extreme non-attainment for all 8 hour standards. This is extreme non-attainment is the highest classification allowed under the Clean Air Act, and essentially that allows us the most time to meet a standard. This presentation is focused on addressing contingency measure elements specifically for the 2008 8 hour ozone standard, which has an attainment date of July 2032. Next slide. I also want to provide some background on state implementation plans, or SIPs. The Federal Clean Air Act requires states to meet National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS. As part of that, we have to conduct a variety of planning exercises demonstrating how we will meet the NAAQS by a specific date. And that's really where SIPs come in. So SIPs, or plans, are comprehensive documents that include dozens of individual planning elements, such as attainment and reasonable further progress demonstrations, a control strategy, and, as is relevant to the topic of today's presentation, contingency measures. Each individual planning element can trigger sanctions if it's not submitted, if it gets disapproved by EPA, or is not implemented. Next slide, please. So South Coast AQMD developed an attainment plan that included contingency measure elements, and that was submitted to EPA in 2017. However, EPA subsequently revised its policy on contingency measures in response to multiple lawsuits, which led to South Coast AQMD withdrawing the contingency measure elements in June of 2022 to avoid EPA disapproval. That then established a deadline where we have to submit new contingency measure elements to EPA by April 30th of this year. Next slide. So I mentioned that contingency measures are just one of many ozone SIP requirements. Contingency measures are measures that are intended to reduce emissions if an area fails to meet an air quality standard by the attainment date or fails to make reasonable further progress. EPA requires that contingency measures be in addition to already existing measures, as well as any measures that are relied upon for attainment. Next slide. Here's some more requirements for contingency measures. They must be a rule or measure ready to implement without significant further action by the state or EPA. They must become effective within 60 days and achieve reductions within 2 years from the triggering event. They must achieve a quantity of emission reductions that's referred to as 1 year's worth of progress. I'll be explaining that in a little more detail in a few slides. However, if a measure achieves less than 1 year's worth of reductions, then the state or agency is required to present a justification why no other measures are feasible. This is especially important for areas like the Coachella Valley, which is an extreme non-attainment for multiple ozone standards. And as a result, South Coast AQMD is obligated to enact all feasible measures for attainment. Next slide. So we began our search for contingency measures by thoroughly examining the emission sources in Coachella Valley and identifying applicable rules. Next, we compared existing rule requirements with those in other areas to identify potential measures. We then reviewed the potential measures to determine if they were feasible to serve as a contingency measure. However, if the reduction from the identified measures was less than the required threshold, we proceeded to develop a justification why no other measures were feasible. Next slide. Now I'll discuss the proposed contingency measure and infeasibility justification. Next slide. The proposed contingency measure involves Rule 463, organic liquid storage. This rule applies to above-ground organic liquid storage tanks, for example, gasoline storage tanks, and it seeks to reduce fugitive VOC emissions from those storage tanks. South Coast AQMD is currently amending Rule 463 to introduce a contingency measure that would require more frequent inspections of organic liquid storage tanks using a technology known as optical gas imaging, or OGI, in both the South Coast Air Basin and Coachella Valley. OGI is essentially a technology that uses advanced cameras to visualize VOC leaks in real time, and that facilitates leak detection and repair. For additional details on the proposed amended rule, please refer to our website that's linked on this slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so I've mentioned that contingency measures are required to achieve 1 year's worth of reductions. I'm not going to go into the details of the calculation. However, details are available in US EPA's draft guidance on contingency measures. Essentially, we look at our base year inventory, which in this case is 2011, as well as our attainment year inventory, which is 2031. And the annual increment of progress that's required to demonstrate attainment works out to be about 1/3 of a ton of NOx and about 0.15 tons of VOCs. The reductions from the contingency measure in proposed amended Rule 463 will be less than 1 year's worth of progress. Therefore, South Coast AQMD developed an infeasibility justification to demonstrate that there are no other feasible measures. Next slide. Okay, so I've mentioned that South Coast AQMD is obligated to enact all feasible measures for attainment, and therefore this makes it extremely difficult to identify additional measures that can be held in reserve to satisfy the contingency measure requirements. We also, as I mentioned, examined all emission sources in the Coachella Valley, including industrial, residential, commercial, and indirect sources, and identified applicable South Coast AQMD rules and compared those rules with rule requirements in other jurisdictions. This resulted in the identification of several potential measures. However, these measures were determined to be infeasible considering the implementation timeline and/or technological limitations. Next slide. Okay, I'll just wrap up in a few slides. Next. So South Coast AQMD withdrew the contingency measure elements in the previous plan in June of 2022. That led EPA to finalize a finding of failure to submit contingency measures on October 31st of 2022. We then awaited release of US EPA's draft guidance on contingency measures and began developing the staff report for the contingency measure SIP revision, and we released that package on January 17th. Due to the finding of failure to submit that was issued in October 31st of 2022, that set up a sanction clock that will expire on April 30th of this year, and that will be the stationary source permit sanctions that will kick in if South Coast AQMD has not submitted and US EPA has not determined to be the submission to be complete. If the SIP revision still has not been submitted by October 31st of this year and US EPA has not determined that submission to be complete, then the highway sanctions will kick in. In addition, if EPA has not approved the SIP revision, then the Coachella Valley will be subject to a federal implementation plan for contingency measures. Next slide, please. In summary, Coachella Valley is an extreme non-attainment for the 2008 ozone standard. South Coast AQMD is required to develop a contingency measure SIP package and submit that to EPA by April 30th. Otherwise, sanctions will kick in. South Coast AQMD commits to consider adopting and amending Rule 463 to include a contingency measure in both the South Coast Air Basin and Coachella Valley. The South Coast AQMD Governing Board will be considering this contingency measure SIP revision on March 1st. If it's adopted, the SIP will be submitted to EPA via CARB. Next slide. Okay, so here's some information on our public process. We released the draft staff report on January 17th. We are now holding the public consultation meetings. We will be briefing our Mobile Source Committee on February 16th. February 16th is also the deadline to submit written comments on the staff report. Our governing board will be holding a public hearing on March 1st, and then the SIP package, if adopted, will be submitted to EPA via CARB. Next slide. All supporting documents are available on our website, including this presentation as well as the staff report. You can also use the QR code here to be taken directly to that website. Next slide. Please address questions, comments, documents, or other relevant information to aqmp.team@aqmd.gov. Please remember that the written comment deadline is Friday, February 16th. Thank you for your attention, and that concludes my presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. So that gets us through our first presentation on the South Coast AQMD part of this meeting. I'm going to turn now to Kirsten Ho, who will discuss CARB's contingency measures.
Great. Thanks, Ian. I think, are the slides up yet, or?
They aren't quite up yet. I think they're being brought up right now. Maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Kirsten Ho. Good morning. I'm with the California Air Resources Board. I work on the South Coast Air Quality Planning section. I'm one of the staff working on contingency measures for CARB. So I'll be giving a quick summary of CARB's submission of the recently adopted smog check contingency measure for the SIP, which we submitted in November of 2023. Next slide. So first, CARB staff conducted an infeasibility analysis to supplement the smog check contingency measure. Staff analyzed control measures for all sources that CARB currently controls to identify potential contingency measure options. These sources include light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles and trucks, off-road equipment, consumer products, and others that are listed here. For all of these sources, CARB has programs currently in place or under development, and we evaluated a variety of regulatory mechanisms within our existing and new programs for potential contingency triggers. Next slide. When it comes to these types of programs, we considered a few options for contingency measures, like requiring more stringent standards, pulling forward compliance deadlines, increasing percentage sales or purchase requirements, or enhancing testing and enforcement. However, given the requirements for contingency, there are limitations. The regulatory process can take up to 5 years. CARB regulations are technology forcing and generally the most stringent in the country, with many driving to zero emissions. In addition, industry and manufacturers need lead time to develop, manufacture, and deploy new technologies or products. Going to zero is also needed for attainment, which eliminates opportunities for contingency measures. And so based on these limitations, staff identified the smog check contingency measure as the best opportunity for a triggered contingency measure. And at this time, no other measures have been identified as feasible, but staff continues to search for options. Next slide. So now some quick background on the smog check program. So the smog check program is administered by the Bureau of Automotive Repair, or BAR, and the California Department of Motor Vehicles, or DMV. Smog checks are required every 2 years in most areas of the state for light-duty vehicles, depending on the severity of the area's air quality issues. There are a few exceptions, though. So motorcycles and electric vehicles are exempt. And also, per a change in statute in 2017, vehicles that are 8 model years old and newer are also currently exempt. And the exemption was actually previously 6 model years old and newer, but the legislature extended the exemption through AB 1274 to 8 model years old and newer. They also foresaw the possible need to change these exemption years back and gave CARB the flexibility to do so within the provision, which states that these vehicles are exempt unless CARB finds providing these exemptions prevents the state from meeting SIP requirements. So in lieu of the smog check inspection, these vehicles pay an annual smog abatement fee, which goes in part towards funding CARB's Carl Moyer Incentive Program. Next slide. So now for the details of the actual smog check contingency measure. So if the measure is triggered in an area, one model year of exemptions from light duty smog check would be removed, and then those vehicles in that area would have to obtain a smog check inspection. The exemption would change from 8 model years old and newer to 7 model years old and newer. But then if it's triggered a second time for a different milestone or standard in a subsequent year for the same area, the exemption would then change from 7 model years old and newer to 6 model years old and newer. Next slide. So the figure here shows an example of the trigger and implementation timeline for the measure. So first, an area fails to attain the standard, and then up to 6 months later, EPA will publish an official finding of failure to attain. That finding will then be effective 1 month later. And within 30 days of that effective date, CARB would send a letter to BAR and DMV to notify them of the measure being triggered in that specific area. We'll work with BAR and DMV to implement the measure in that area, and the smog check exemption would be removed at the start of the next calendar year, and then reductions would be achieved. Next slide. So the purpose of the smog check program is to reduce air pollution by identifying light-duty vehicles with emission control equipment failures and then have them repaired or retired. Over time, the emission control equipment ages and it might not perform as designed. So this measure would identify those additional failures from the previously exempted vehicles and then correct them. So the measure will provide for real emissions reductions that are beyond what's currently achieved by the smog check program, as well as toxic benzene reductions in the area. For each area, staff did estimate the emissions reductions based on the potential triggering year. And although the reductions are small, it's important to note that this measure is being paired together with the district's efforts and then also CARB's and feasibility analysis to meet the contingency measure requirements consistent with EPA's draft guidance. As we move forward, CARB staff will continue to explore additional opportunities for SIP contingency measures. Next slide. Staff did engage in a public process to develop this measure. So we released a concept document for this measure for input from the public back in August, on August 11th, 2023. And then we held a public workshop to present the concept and solicit feedback from the public in both English and Spanish. Comments were received in support of the measure, and one requested staff examine the impacts to the Moyer program more closely, which we did in our staff report. The proposal was then released for 30-day comment on September 15th, 2023, and the CARB board adopted the measure on October 26th, 2023. Staff then submitted the measure to US EPA in November to be incorporated into the California SIP, and EPA has since proposed approval of the smog check contingency measure as of December 20th, 2023. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Appreciate that. So now we've gotten through both our presentations. I see that we have some attendees here. Now is an opportunity for public comment or question on either presentation. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to use the raise hand feature in Zoom. That's the button at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to keep talking here to stretch out and give people an opportunity. If you wanted to make any comment or if you had any questions, go ahead and raise your hand now in Zoom. If you want to go back and think about it a little bit and get back to us, we had the contact information in the slides, and so you can get back to us outside of this meeting as well. And we will respond in the final package. I'm going to give it one last chance here to see if anybody has any questions or comments. Okay, not seeing any. So with that, I'm going to thank everybody for attending today. And again, feel free to reach out to us, the contact information that we provided, if you have any questions or comments. And we look forward until the next time. So have a good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. Bye now.